Dear colleagues and friends, it's a real pleasure and great honor for me to chair this session and introduce to you Professor Craig Calhoun, Director of the London School of Economics and Political Science. You may know that Professor Calhoun was appointed to this position from this month, September 2012, so we should be proud that one of his first visits, or maybe the very first international visit, has been arranged to Moscow to the High School of Economics. Let me give you a short biographical note of our featured speaker. Craig Kалхун received his bachelor's degree in anthropology and cinema at the University of Southern California. Then he was taught at master's programs in anthropology and sociology at Columbia University and then at Manchester University. He received his doctorate in sociology and modern social and economic history from Oxford University, so all good universities now. And he started his professional career at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Then he moved to the New York University as chair of the Department of Sociology and later as director of the Institute for Public Knowledge. Apart from that, he was giving lectures worldwide in Beijing, in Paris, in Khartoum, in Oslo, in Oxford, almost everywhere. Craig Kалхун is very widely known as president of the Social Science Research Council. He's been president of this council for more than 10 years, and I must say that SSRC is one of the most influential non-state agencies providing research grants and promoting collaborations among academics from divergent disciplines and emphasizing the public contributions of social science. And I should add that many international scholars, distinguished scholars, got the opportunity to come to Russia due to the support of SSRC. Professor Calhoun is also well known as a distinguished scholar. He's working on the tradition of critical theory, and he's been studying a wide range of topics, including nationalism, culture and communication, social movements, the impact of technological change, education and religion, and this is not the end of the list. He has written more than 100 scholarly papers and books, published a lot of books and chapters in the books, and translated quite a number of volumes, and his books and articles were translated in more than a dozen languages. One of his major books, Nationalism, was translated into Russian 5 years ago. Just to prove that, I'm showing it to you. Yeah, he recognized it. And the title of today's lecture is Social and Political Challenges Facing Global Capitalism. So, Professor Kалхун, welcome to the High School of Economics. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, it's a great pleasure and a privilege for me to visit the Higher School for Economics, and in particular the International College for Economics and Finance. The London School of Economics, the LSE, is proud of its relationship with ISEF and the Higher School. This is partly because of its quality, but also because of its mission. The Higher School and ISEF and the LSE share a mission of advancing social science and economics, both as science and as a practical engagement with the world. The LSE was founded in 1895 precisely because a group of leading thinkers of the time believed that new conditions in the world demanded new kinds of knowledge. At that time, Oxford University, for example, had barely begun to teach economics and declined to establish a department or a chair in economics, thinking this field probably wouldn't really last. The widespread view was that this was merely a sort of technical matter, possibly of use to some trades, but not of basic scholarly importance. The founders of the London School denied this, suggesting that economics and political science and other related fields, for the name of the LSE is really the London School of Economics and Political Science, suggesting that these new fields and that statistical knowledge that came with these fields was crucial to making a better society, and that precisely in this modern era, it was possible to use the tools of science to advance society, to engage in informed criticism of existing institutions, but also to undertake to create new social institutions, to evaluate their effectiveness, and to train the professionals who would lead those institutions. The institutions included the state, but they also included private business and the growing ranks of non-governmental organizations that were crucial to building a new kind of society. Over time, the London School of Economics became increasingly international until it became perhaps the most global institution of social science in the world. And it began to create partnerships with a few others that shared its vision. And so I'm pleased that the Higher School for Economics was created here, that it also responded to this call that new times and new social conditions required new sorts of knowledge. And not just new knowledge once, but new knowledge continuously created through research, and knowledge that would be shared with students on the basis of their merits, of their demonstrated academic qualifications and willingness to study, in order that there would be skilled professionals to certainly take the jobs that were on offer in the current economy, but also to build the society of the future. For the work of business, many state institutions and many others, is precisely to build the future, to create the conditions in which we will live. So it is a great pleasure for me to work with all of you, and especially I want to thank Sergei Yakovlev, my colleague Richard Jackman from the London School of Economics. They are the key joint animators of ISEF. I thank all of our other colleagues in this, and especially Vadim Radayev. Now, I indicated that I would speak on social and political challenges for capitalism. And I mean to take a relatively wide view of this. This is not a technical paper on one aspect or another, but an attempt to think about the big picture, or one part of the big picture. And in particular, to think about the context within which economic activity, more narrowly understood, takes place. Capitalism, of course, is not merely markets, which have existed through history, not simply in the particular form of a capitalist era. Capitalism exists arguably in at least 4 dimensions, each of which raise different questions about the challenges before it, and in each of which we see something of the reasons why there may be both crisis in the world and good reason to believe that capitalism can renew and regenerate itself in this world, and therefore to ask questions about just what the challenges are. One of these forms or dimensions is risk-taking entrepreneurship. For some thinkers, this is at the heart of the project of capitalism. The individual entrepreneur or the group of entrepreneurs joined in a company who launch a new technology, market a new product, take risks, and lay claim to profits on the basis of this investment and this risk. A thinker like the great economic historian Henri Pirenne traces the whole history of capitalism in this form. A second idea is the exploitation of free labor in profit-making production that also augments capital. So a key feature of capitalism, as distinct from pre-capitalist economies around the world and other forms, is the freedom of individuals to choose or at least secure employment and undertake careers in different kinds of industries. This idea of free labor, as Karl Marx most famously emphasized, is not without its cost. He pointed out the freedom to choose which bridge you might lie down under in poverty. But it is also an important, more structural relation that states do not assign people to particular economic conditions, that inheritance of parents' economic roles does not define the opportunities for their children, that people are hired and fired, that employment is therefore a variable relationship. And this has major impacts on the organization of capitalism as a labor-based enterprise. A third idea is an economic system driven by accumulation of wealth in the form of productive capital. And here I group together finance and other so-called real or industrial forms of capital and point out that it is a relatively distinctive thing in history to accumulate capital and not seek to convert most of it to other forms. That is, to accumulate productive capital, investments in making more money, investments in making more goods, right? And not convert that simply into luxury or into other kinds of consumer goods or into investments in land and the life of a traditional aristocrat. Relatively distinctively in the recent modern world, a system has grown up in which that drive to accumulate wealth has been basic and has shaped not only individual capitalist careers, but the growth of corporations able to do this on a scale far larger than any individual capitalists, enduring much longer. Now, there are a variety of further issues to this, and I'm not proposing to go into the economics of all this narrowly. Understood, I'm merely setting a stage. But I could note that this economic system driven by the accumulation of wealth comes with concomitant tensions between finance and so-called real industry, or forms of material production, with phases such as those that are analyzed in the idea of Kondratiev waves, the great Russian economist, the notion that there are expansions and contractions, but more basically periods of industrial accumulation, periods of a shift to finance, and so forth. And that there are pressures in this for both expansion and intensification. That is, what it means for capitalism to be a system driven by the accumulation of wealth is that it has to keep moving forward, that it cannot stand still, that new technologies, new organization and processes of labor, and new reach out into other parts of the world or into parts of life like what had previously been family relations is continuous. The capitalism must continuously expand and or intensify. So it is driven. Standing still is not a viable option. Fourth, the differentiation of an apparently self-moving economy of markets and private property from states and other social relations is part of what we signal by capitalism. That is, the very idea that there is an economy identifiable as such, that there are economic relations distinguishable from other political and social relations. This is in part an ideological notion. That is, it's in part an attempt by some people to get the rest of us to think this way, to leave the market alone, we may say to politicians. But it's a very productive and constructive ideology. It's not just a question of is it right or not? Are capitalist economies really completely self-sufficient? Of course they're not, right? But the attempt to make them more or less internally organized on the basis of economic activity rather than political intervention or other kinds of social considerations is constitutive. It shapes the nature of capitalism. This may be a central part of what I mean by capitalism narrowly understood. Capitalism, insofar as we accept a set of assumptions as basic to our theories, which more or less hold constant or rule out of consideration political interventions and other kinds of social conditions. And of course, we may, in any particular research, relax some of those assumptions. We may note that the assumption of unlimited liquidity is not realistic, that we need to recognize demographic factors as having an economic influence, and those demographic factors as reflecting decisions made by people in their family lives, not entirely on the basis of economic principles, and so forth and so on. That is, we can say that everything is connected to everything else, but in order to do good research and modeling, we don't approach it as connected all the time. We hold some things constant. And in order to allow business people to do their work, we build some kinds of buffers between them and other aspects of society. So this is an ideology, but it's productive in securing relative economy for business. Now, all of this is stage setting just to say what I mean by talking about capitalism at all. There are certainly contradictions in the workings of capitalism, and recent and continuing global upheavals manifest some of these. But I want to suggest none of these contradictions is in itself fatal. So my operating beginning assumption is, considered purely as an economic system, capitalism can recover from all of its current crises and resume growth. If that doesn't happen, it will be mainly for other reasons. I don't mean that there aren't internal reasons. I don't mean that the system is not prone to crisis or that there aren't other issues, but that it's largely in the relationships between economic activity and social and political activity that we have to look for the biggest challenges to the future today. Let me put that in another blunt way. Some large percentage of you, because you are smart and wisely came to the higher school, or ISEF, some large percentage of you will land high-paying jobs with Goldman Sachs, or McKinsey, or Sparbank. The question of whether those are still good jobs when you are 50 will depend not just on the economic models that we operate with, but on the relationship of economic institutions, of markets and firms, to the legal framework, the political framework, and the social conditions in which capitalism develops or stalls and begins to stop moving forward, potentially moves backward, or unravels. So I've painted a picture, very, very general picture, of what we might call an embedded capitalism. Capitalism not all by itself, just as an abstract system, a formal model, but capitalism in the real world, embedded in a complex range of connections. Implicit in the choice of the word embedded is a nod to Karl Polanyi. It is currently fashionable to nod to Polanyi. He has gone in and out of fashion over a long period of time. But his thinking has been particularly back in fashion since the economic crisis of 2008, which is also the economic crisis of 2009 and 2010 and 2011 and 2012. But I mean something broader than Polanyi in the specific. Capitalism has always depended on states, governments, and on not completely economic forms of civil society. It has depended on these for both physical and financial infrastructure. Capitalism has depended on governments that build roads, enabling businesses to externalize the costs of transportation. It has depended on government guarantees for monetary systems that provide a sort of financial infrastructure and basis for economic operations. It has depended on family life for social reproduction, for health and education, and as families were no longer able to provide for all of this, on governments that took on the provision of education, health, pensions as public goods. It will not be lost on anyone in Russia today that there are questions about the capacity of the state to provide these forms of social reproduction as public goods widely available to the population. Arguments over pensions are going on as we speak at the White House in Russia. These are not merely costs. They are often discussed in terms of the question, can we afford this? Can the state afford it without going bankrupt? But they are also investments in reproduction, in the existence of various of the social conditions on which capitalism depends in the future. Education, obviously, is important for skilled manpower. Right? But beyond this, social reproduction suggests things like having the social order, the functioning society, as a basis that will allow for the protection of private property or for carrying out business. Secondly, capitalism has always been global. It has always worked within a world system of states. As capitalism grew up, globalizing, right? But globalizing in a system of states. Not global instead of states, global through states, global putting pressure on states, global sometimes leading to war among states. States acted not least to protect their core industries and to project them into new markets. And so the growth of large capitalist firms has always been interdependent with governments and states. It's an illusion to imagine that you could even have this history of growth without relations to states. Capitalism has also always been structured by relations between firms of larger and smaller capital. One of the illusions in some of the ways we often talk about the economy and action in it is that we talk in relatively scale-independent terms. Only a fraction of our models take scale really seriously. That is, what is the difference between Citigroup or Sparbank or other large firms and small owner-operated firms? How does this matter? How does it matter in their relationship to the state, in their ability to provide for employees? One of the things that has gone on in the world, and I'll come back to this briefly, is that people depend more and more on employment in large corporations for benefits that were previously distributed by states on the basis of citizenship. In many parts of the world, it's what company you work for that determines much of your access to social benefits, not just what your central government offers you. This is a long-term shift, but it's also challenged by breakups of large corporations. In general, larger firms benefit from special relations to states. The very idea of the corporation, the very form, the thing, the corporation, is itself, in many ways, an emblem of this. It is, on the one hand, deeply dependent on states for formal recognition and legal arrangements. In the United States history, the idea of a business corporation dates in an important sense from an 1817 Supreme Court decision. Supreme Court decision in which then Chief Justice Marshall famously said that corporations had no soul to damn, no body to kick, and yet we needed to recognize them as being, for all legal purposes, persons. It's a decision which was recently reaffirmed by the United States Supreme Court and extended when the Supreme Court ruled that the constitutional protection of free speech extended to business corporations and their advertising, including political advertising. Okay? Now, there's an interesting extension from the idea of a physical human person, a living being, to a corporation as a legal person, but corporations are able to own property, to enter into contracts, to sue in courts of law, not only with each other, but with human individuals. Okay? This existence of the idea of the corporation may appear to be sort of a way of calling something into being out of imagination. It's a way of turning a contract between people, the initial parties who create the corporation, into something bigger, something enduring, and something materially significant. Does anyone doubt that Apple or Microsoft, right, are significant economic forces, that they have a material existence, that they matter in material ways? Yet they exist in part because they are recognized in a legal process, or rather in a set of legal processes with slightly different national variations. And they are recognized, reproduced over and over and over again in trials all the time. Okay? They are also social organizations. Okay? That is, they involve thousands of people, hundreds of thousands in the case of the two I just named, who work for them, who are related to them, who are organized in them. Okay? So they are social organizations, and they are creatures of the law as well as of the economy in a specific sense. They are creatures of hierarchy, politics, and of internal, not wholly economic relations. Finally, capitalism has always been, as I suggested, shaped by phases. The classic Polanyian idea of a double movement is part of this. That capitalism always moves in phases of investment and disinvestment, embedding and disembedding, building institutions and breaking institutions down. What that means in part is that an economic model good for one moment in time, in one phase, may not be good for another moment in time in another phase. And this is in part what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the talk. But the key issue here is the creation and destruction of institutions. Polanyi was concerned, like a variety of others, that capitalism was breaking down some of the key institutions on which it itself depended. Government institutions and civil society institutions. For example, that capitalism depended in some part on community life to maintain public order in a relatively low-cost fashion. But capitalism drove a transformation to large cities that eroded community life, replaced it with the kind of scenes you see in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, and therefore created a new sort of social cost and challenge. But capitalism also creates new institutions, like the business corporation itself. So there's a complex relationship. This is also linked to Schumpeter's idea of creative destruction. Joseph Schumpeter wrote about how essential it is for capitalism to destroy in order to create. To break down old industries, to create new ones, but with them to break down whole cities that depended on those whole industries. To break down whole firms that depended on it, to disrupt and change people's lives. So what for Schumpeter was a necessary virtue was for many others a social fault. Daniel Bell, an American sociologist, famously wrote about the cultural contradictions of capitalism. the possibility that the system rose on ethics of hard work and commitment and risk-taking, and that it produced people, I've learned that I should think of them as Oblamovs, that it produced people who were lazy and didn't want to take risks and just wanted to enjoy the benefits without the hard work of capitalism. And so capitalism undermined some of its own cultural conditions. And obviously Marx saw a recurrent pattern of self-destruction. So what is our historical moment, our crisis today, and what does this tell us about the social and political challenges before us? I will resist the temptation to try to take a really long view, stretching back into the 19th century or the 17th century. Let me shorten the story. Our current situation is embedded in a history, and we can't understand it without a little bit of that history. Take the post-war era, after World War II. Reconstruction in Europe, reconstruction in the Soviet Union, after massive destruction during the war. Shaping industrial investments, shaping economic conditions. In most of the West, a long secular boom. The French call it les 30 glorieuses, 30 glorious years of continuously improving living standards, growth and institutional opening up to democracy. Industrialization took place both in the communist world and in the West, divided by the Cold War, but marked by considerable institutional convergence. Neither actually existing socialism nor capitalist democracy lived up to its own ideals for itself. But we saw an economy throughout this period driven by material production. The Soviet economy and the US economy alike were driven by making things. They were driven by material production. During this period, in almost every industrial society in the world, and again, socialist and capitalist alike, inequality went down. The inequality in societies went down. The Gini coefficient shrank, if you want to measure it that way. Right? It was reduced by each sort of system that participated in large-scale industrialization, largely because widespread employment and the labor pressures related to it generated a relatively substantial middle to the systems. In the 1970s, there were a set of pivotal crises. In the West, they are legion. Right? The Vietnam War dragged on, and interestingly, was financed almost entirely on credit. One of the sources of the financial era and the long financial boom that would follow the 1970s is Richard Nixon's recognition that the Vietnam War was so unpopular that he could not get bills through Congress to pay for it by tax revenues directly, and therefore financed it overwhelmingly on credit. So the world's most powerful government and largest economy began to support a dramatic expansion of financial assets. At more or less the same time, there was a collapse of the Bretton Woods financial institutions, the old gold standard in favor of fiat money, and a transformation that led to more or less financial institutions as we know them. There was also the Yom Kippur War, in which conflict in the Middle East led to, among other things, the enduring problems of the occupied territories in the Middle East, but also to an Arab response that included using the OPEC, the Association of Petroleum Exporting Countries, to drive up the price of oil, multiplying it, right, by many times in the space of just a few years, creating a petro boom, which resonates in the world to the present day. I just heard that planning for the future of the Soviet Union officially pegs the price of crude oil at $91 to the gallon. Unofficially, probably needs for this to be over 100, maybe 110 to make the budget work. It was $3 per gallon before the OPEC action in the wake of the Yom Kippur War, 1973-74. In addition, the windfall profits in oil-producing countries led to the establishment of the world's first sovereign wealth funds. The growth of sovereign wealth funds, notably, say, that in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates, which is the world's largest sovereign wealth fund today, comes directly from that moment of political response manipulating oil prices after a destructive war. Okay? Not simply in the economy by itself. And then that helped to bring on the 1974-75 recession, or 73-75, depending on where you trace it. And this helped to set in motion a long-term inflation because the response to the recession, combined with the earlier expansion of credit, was a long-term availability of easier and easier money. Now, that's just a sort of thumbnail sketch of a crisis, but it turned an economy based on the production of goods throughout most of the Western world into an economy increasingly based on finance. The greatest profits were to be made in financial institutions. So one of the things that happened was an extraordinary acceleration of how much of the world's assets were held in the terms of financial instruments, in the form of financial instruments. One of the conditions of the crisis of the last 5 years is that so much wealth was held in the form of financial instruments that a fall in the price of financial assets could have the dramatic effect it had. If a smaller fraction of the world's assets were held, right, it would be much less. Now, in the so-called communist world of the time, there were repercussions and there were independent events of their own. I won't take the time to try to trace all of this, but some of the beginnings of stagnation in the Soviet Union traced to the same period, aided and abetted by a new kind of strategic competition from the West based on the use of credit-backed financial instruments to gauge in forms of military expansion seeking to drive an arms race that would be so expensive it was not sustainable by the economy. It's also the period of the student protests around the world and the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution in China, an enormous upheaval there that took a generation to shake out and helped to lay some of the foundations for what would begin in 1992 as China's remarkable rise in economic productivity and wealth. Financialization in the West and much of Asia was accompanied by what often gets called neoliberalism. A lot of debate over whether that's a good word for it. But that is by a set of policies, remember back to Polanyi and destruction and rebuilding of institutions, a set of policies that essentially eroded existing institutions of all kinds, or almost destroyed unions throughout most of the capitalist world, for example. From the Thatcher era in Europe, or even before that, the Pinochet era in Chile, through the Reagan era in the United States, and on to the present, there was a concerted attempt to try to establish something closer to the ideal of a purely liberal economy of individuals on the side of labor, reductions in state welfare payments, right? Shifts of institutions of various kinds. Simple example. In the United States, right, there was almost an inversion in higher education, in universities like this one. The inversion was that prior to that, throughout the entire post-war boom, spending on public universities outstripped spending on private universities. Starting in 1975 and consecutively every year to the present, spending on private universities has outstripped spending on public universities. All right? Now, some of this history has its condensed echo since the 90s in Russia. But in any case, it's a part of a larger sort of transformation, and I would suggest phase shift, and we may be in a period where some of the shift turns the other way. Much neglected in the West, though I think noticed a little bit more here, is the end of the Soviet Union itself, and more generally, the events of 1989 to 1992, transforming Eastern Europe and elsewhere. This had a variety of effects in the world, ranging from putting all sorts of arms loose on global markets, through to removing the idea of an opposition to capitalism. But a great deal of global instability was produced. It is not unreasonable to suggest that the end of the Soviet Union brought not only a rapacious new kind of acquisition here, in the so-called Big Bang moment, but a new environment on a global scale for primitive accumulation, if you will. What followed from the 1970s, with various crises and upheavals up until the present day, was a new kind of accumulation and a new boom in accumulation, largely via finance. Dramatic increase in finance, yielding crises at various points, 1997, 2002, 2008, and so forth, but a boom in finance. These crises were not the result of individuals who did bad things. One of the illusions that was circulated in 2008 and after was that this was all the result of some bad people, bad apples they were often called, Bernard Madoff or others who were crooks. But this was much more built into the system. It was built into innovations in financial engineering, which also made possible massive investments in new technologies. On the good side, we would not have all these nice new technologies without this massive investment, but at the same time, it created new vulnerabilities. Among other things, regulatory institutions did not catch up to both technological and financial transformations. Hedge funds being the key example. Hedge funds were not deregulated in the West. They were never seriously regulated. They grew up outside of regulation. In fact, arguably, the best definition of a hedge fund is that it operates outside strict regulation. In other words, that a legal regime that governs lots of other investments and other companies doesn't govern them as closely. Okay? It's not that they invest in so-called alternative investments. It's not that they trade faster. These may or may not be true, but they're not definitive. Okay? Well, the massive technological transformation itself was huge and created all sorts of impacts that I don't have time to try to detail, but I think will be generally familiar. What I do want to try to point out is the extent to which this financial transformation, the investment in microelectronics, biotechnologies, the other reshaping technologies, the present era, that created such huge economic transformations, right, was made possible not simply by, as it were, rational, prudent investment, but by large-scale risk-taking. That is, not simply by investing on the basis of foreseeable returns, 5 or 10 or 20%, but investing on the basis of potential dramatically larger returns. This had financed the railroad boom in the 19th century as well, with bond issues and stock. And in this period, venture capital moved to the fore, became a phrase. Hardly anyone knew the phrase venture capital before about the 1990s. Right? New amounts of wealth, some of them linked to things like the sovereign wealth funds and other things, some of them individuals, made possible investing even in the face of the knowledge that the majority of firms in an industry would go bankrupt. If one of them might be a Google, it was worth betting on a lot of others. Okay? And this went on, and there were better and worse bets. But it was a challenge, I would suggest, to thinking narrowly about the economy as a self-contained system, right? Because it depended on relations to these other factors, as I've tried to lay out. Now, in all of this, there is shifting global momentum, a rise of China, rise of Southeast Asia, rise of Brazil, the transformation of Russia, potentially one of these economies that will be world-shaping in this context. And we might ask ourselves, will the world system of modern capitalism survive? Now, remember, I tipped my hand in one sense at the beginning. I think there's no economic reason capitalism will not survive, will not generate new patterns of growth, and will not make sure that you can have high-paying jobs in 25 years. But there are a lot of social and political reasons to think that might be in doubt, or at least something to worry about and work on. For one thing, Throughout its history, the capitalist world system has depended on some pattern of hegemony, some leadership structure by one country, the Netherlands, Britain, the United States, one after another, that was able to solve collective action problems and generate relative agreement to global trading standards and other kinds of normative structures. Will the United States go on being the global hegemon? It seems to me the United States is getting tired of this, of bearing the costs associated with it, and that the world is getting a bit tired of the United States doing it. But it's not obvious to me that China is in a position to step in and play that role, to lead the WTO, to back the IMF, to organize the conditions of global capitalism. And it's certainly not obvious to me that we have such a harmonious world system that a multilateral organization in which the top 4 or 5 or 10 economies all work cooperatively is on the horizon. So I think we have a real question about the collective action dilemma of having order on a global scale, the governance that follows from it. And we have essentially the possibilities of renewal. The US gets a sort of new phase of energy. Multilateral reorganization, which would take a big shift in how our leaders think. Or chaos, and that's worrying. There are a number of other social and political challenges, and I'll wind up relatively quickly. There's simply the massive, wrenching Schumpeterian transition. We aren't finished with new technologies. In fact, most of the hopes for a new era of growth depend on still more new technologies and a great deal of upheaval that comes with them. But there are a number of other changes, and I'm more or less going to list them really rapidly. Think of security concerns at every level, from public safety on the streets in much of the world through to global conflict. There are massive security issues in the world. They are not more or less tamed, as in the Cold War, by any structure of superpowers. They're increasingly challenging. Arms sales are up. In the West, people spoke after 1989-92 of a peace dividend. The economy would thrive more because less money would need to be spent on weapons and there would be less destruction and conflict. The evidence is equivocal. There's some reduction in conflict at a large interstate war level, but small wars are up, and conflict and insecurity is up. This links to an issue of illicit flows. Many states throughout the world, and none more than Russia, have lost much of their ability to effectively manage their borders. Foreign direct investment statistics for Russia are extremely instructive. I imagine some of you have studied them. Since you might ask yourself whether it's really possible for Cyprus and the Cayman Islands to generate huge amounts of capital to invest in Russia. But of course, this is largely Russian money laundered through Cyprus and the Cayman Islands in what is, in fact, one of the largest industries, if you want to class it that way, offshore capitalism. Untaxed or minimally taxed, largely unregulated capitalism. Some of it in completely legitimate businesses, just not paying taxes. Right? Much of it in various forms of trafficking, drugs or arms, or women and people generally. And a large offshore capitalist industry is one of the major challenges for the survival of the more or less legitimate capitalist industries in much of the world, including here. And it relates to domestic economic crime, the rise of large-scale economic crime in various settings. There's also the problem of the continuous habit of mortgaging the future, the fact that politicians seem unable to resist promising such levels of growth that they can only be financed by credit and by mortgaging the future in various ways, either environmentally or in other terms. It seems to be the case, particularly as a problem of democracies, that politicians, right, will try to offer people good things now at the expense of a generation or two in the future. There are issues that I described before under the language of social reproduction. How well is education working? Healthcare, right? All of these sorts of social institutions that provide for the future, even family life. There's a demographic crisis that takes one form here and different forms in other parts of the world and is a real challenge for much of capitalism. The demand for labor and labor force participation runs up against reassertions of nationalism and other sorts of issues. Urbanization and infrastructure are exciting but impose costs. There is, I think, increasingly a return of geopolitics, the sort of old fault lines between empires, and the dominance of regions by strong powers, a restructuring of regions. There's a role of religion in international affairs that it hasn't played in a century, but that is extremely significant on various scales. I've already mentioned the reassertion of nationalism, which many people thought was fading because modern capitalism would just generate global flows of wealth and global enterprise, and nations would matter less. One of the questions in all of this is what forms of government are required to accomplish taxation, order, and social reproduction. If you take it as necessary to capitalism that there be some level of functioning government to provide basic conditions, the operation, security, for example, how effective will governments be at financing themselves, and what kind of governments will they have to be to accomplish it? How authoritarian, how restrictive, how intrusive? The same for order, the same for social reproduction. In many places, democracy appears to be getting less and less liberal, less and less respectful of individual rights, more and more authoritarian. What kind of reinstitutionalization will we see in the world if this is a phase of reinstitutionalization? We see in much of Europe the destruction of old forms of welfare states. We see welfare states being built in China and Korea and other countries. How will they be built? In what fashion? I think that we may actually, ironically, be in an era where Europe, no longer in the lead, is not the present-day leader, but is a kind of model, as a number of other countries struggle to build some of the kinds of state institutions that provided for reproduction earlier there. I think that corporations are particularly interesting because they play welfare functions, because so many people get benefits that would otherwise be citizen benefits through employment. In South Africa today, the largest predictor of whether somebody with AIDS can get antiretroviral treatment, or in fact of whether anybody can get advanced medical care, is who they work for. Because most global corporations finance this for their employees for sound economic reasons, but it's not available to the majority of the population. The same is true increasingly around the world. We have, in short, a crisis of solidarity. I haven't even mentioned environmental issues, resource constraints, the possibility of resource wars and conflicts that already exist, or return to that issue of inequality, which increased in most of the world, sometimes quite dramatically, that is to say, by as much as 40 times during the last 35 years. Right? Will it decrease with these new welfare states? Will it not? Increasingly, corporations themselves become political actors all around the world, in the United States as much as in Russia. There are a variety of proposals for a kind of localist downscaling, sort of anarchist projects like those that were linked to much of Occupy Wall Street and the other movements of occupying squares around the world, but there's not much evidence they can scale up. In short, and I will close with this, right? I think we are in need for some real imagination to try to think of viable models to organize the context within which capitalism can thrive and do what it does well, which is to produce growth, and to distribute it widely, which it does well mainly when finance is not completely dominant. The contexts are in such upheaval that although capitalism itself is completely capable of renewal, it may be on its last legs because it's not able to get what it depends on from politics and the rest of society. Thanks.
Skeptical about the future of capitalism when money, land, and labor force are becoming goods and trade on the markets. But I have understood that you are optimist. You're an optimist. You think that capitalism will survive. But my question is, what are the most important dangers which can jeopardize or challenge the capitalism we know as it is? What is the most important? What probably can make Polanyi's worries realize?
My analysis was not so far different from Polanyi's in terms of saying the biggest threats to capitalism are not inside capitalist industry, but everything it depends on in the rest of society. I'm slightly more optimistic because I've seen more successes of capitalism in generating another level of growth. So Polanyi coupled his analysis of the contextual problems to a suggestion that capitalism might run into permanent problems internally. We've seen over and over again capitalism able to regenerate itself, but I would suggest at the cost of undermining so many things in the rest of society that it depends on, that's the cost. But if I were to say a positive thing that is the big challenge that's sort of within our hands, it's what I called social reproduction, or building the institutions. I would say that we've gone through a phase of 35 or 40 years of tearing down social institutions. It has taken different forms in the West and the East, but it's happened everywhere. Okay? So it took the form of the destruction of the Soviet Union and the institutions that were associated with it, and an inadequate rebuilding of institutions has taken place since then. In the US or in Britain, it took the form of the hollowing out of what used to be called the welfare state and a destruction of institutions that have not yet been rebuilt on new and possibly more cost-effective forms. So I think that's the sort of the more optimistic thing. That's a big problem if we don't do anything about it, but we can clearly do something about it. The more negative thing is, I would say, if capitalism ends, it will not end from an economic crisis, but from war. Right? It will end from outright conflict, either over resources or in the midst of an economic crisis. And so war, such as came at the end of the Great Depression and produced World War II, is a real prospect. I don't see it happening tomorrow. I'm not saying any one country is arming for that war, but that there is a great deal of pressure. Finally, I'd say, what I predict, if you just ask what I actually predict, and I don't say that I can scientifically tell you, it's 23% chance, but my guess is capitalism will survive, but it will lose its ability to organize the whole of a world system or a world economy. And it will be one form of economic organization operating for some firms and people in some parts of the economy, but there will be authoritarian state economies that operate somewhat differently, and there will be other kinds of patchwork of different sorts of economies. And already what we see is that capitalism has expanded to the whole world, but also that some of the most rapidly growing economies are compromises between capitalism and other forms of organization. For example, in relation to free labor or something like that.
You predict that capitalism is able to actually survive, but do you think that it can develop even more eventually?
The question is whether I think capitalism can not only survive but develop even more. If by develop what we mean is create new wealth, create new technologies, create new opportunities, I do think it has this potential. I do not think it is exhausted. Okay? It has that potential, but it can realize that potential only if it can deal with these social and political problems.
Thank you for an interesting lecture. I don't disagree that it is impossible to even imagine capitalism without states. However, isn't it more accurate to say that capitalism grew up in an age of empire and colonialism? And that without colonialism and empire, capitalism could not continue its rapacious growth. Without spatial fixes, without temporal fixes, we cannot continue this mode of social organization. So can we perhaps stop pussyfooting around the violence and the oppression and maybe consider what, I mean, you've already talked about war, but what else?
No, and I would add personal insecurity of all kinds. And so, I said it very rapidly, but you're right. At every scale, from being safe to walk the streets, able to build a small business. I think one of the things going on is relatively large firms can provide security services of their own, and there's an enormous growth in private security services. Small individual capitalists often cannot protect their businesses and their investments. And that's part of why I meant a difference between large and small. I do think there's endemic violence. I think we have a terminological difference that is not terribly interesting, so I'm going to try to make this work. So I mostly agree. The empire-state question is sort of complicated, and I do want to say that it is true that throughout the era of the growth of the nation-state in Europe, those nation-states were also imperial states. That although the United States didn't build very big formal empire, it behaved in an imperialist fashion. So I don't have any problem with agreeing to that. I do think that much of what capitalism produced was a change in the form of international competition and economic flows that was significantly tied to states and differentiated states, and is one of the reasons why formal empire declined as a mode of organizing over the last 100 years in the economy. I think an interesting question now is whether there is some sort of return to empire that will be in the offing, in the prospects, and it's entirely conceivable. And some of the kinds of fights over resources, like what's going on with Japan and China and so forth now, suggest that that's entirely possible. So I'm sympathetic to that line of argument. I just want to hold out the position that states and nation-states matter, that empire is not quite the same thing. And so, that what we mean by empire or imperialism or global exploitation is a sort of set of separate issues that are probably too terminological to sort out here.
You claim that the global economic crisis of 2008, etc., wasn't caused by a group of individuals, and it was more dependent on the system itself. But isn't our economic system and how it is executed is dependent on the people and their decisions? I'm not implying anything.
It's a good question, and I think behind it is an absolutely true point that when we talk about a system, there are people involved behind that system, but it's complicated. There are also cultures and assumptions. So what I mean by saying that the crisis of 2008, say the March 2008 drop in the stock markets or something, wasn't just caused by individuals, is that it depended on a number of factors that were not within the control of any one individual. So some individuals may have knowingly engaged in overextending their leverage limits within firms, for example. Traders behaved badly in that way. But that was linked to things like the rise of quantitative trading technologies, which meant that managers and compliance officers in those same firms were not able or willing to control the traders who overreached their leverage limits. So that and that's just one small example of saying, I think we miss the point if we look for 1 or 10 or 50 or 100 bad people doing bad things and try to blame the crisis on them, that it was much more interdependent with a culture that was a sort of culture of gambling in which everybody played poker as their hobby and was, into showing how macho they were by placing these bets. It was linked to a failure of regulation that was driven partly by ideology and partly by the regulators just being slow to catch up and not having the best and brightest who were working for the firms, right? That it was a more interdependent phenomenon that produced this. Even the famous mortgage-backed securities debacle that central to what pushed the markets over the edge in March 2008 was the bursting of a bubble in mortgage-backed securities. The mortgage-backed securities got going for reasons like an attempt to extend home ownership to a wider part of the population for a relatively benign reason that had very little to do with that. But then they got caught up in a marketing campaign and in a changed context. Then they got bundled together, good mortgages with bad, to create new securitized instruments to trade. And the trades got linked to new insurance schemes and various kinds of attempts to reduce risk that ended up concentrating risk. Right, so if you read something like Gillian Tett's book, Fool's Gold, you see people creating instruments, the effects of which they could not understand. Right? And therefore, what I want to say is, if you worry about these kinds of crises, you have to worry about the whole set of institutions that are in place, not just about whether individual people are honest. So I completely agree there are people there and they should be honest, but that by itself isn't the whole story.
So you started the definition of capitalism in revoking the figure of the entrepreneur, people who take risk and invest their wealth, their human capital and so on. So this is one thing that you can think about capitalism. The other thing is big business, right? So these are those managers that get bonuses but never take any losses, even if things go well, and that they are together with the political elites and making sure that they are going to be bailed out, sharing the markets. So big business plus the government. So is that capitalism, or is it the entrepreneur, or is it a mix of both? I think it goes back to Schumpeter. Maybe you want to comment shortly on that.
Yeah. Really brief. The question is smart. It does go back to Schumpeter. So let me just try to turn it into a statement basically agreeing. Capitalism is not just one thing. It's not just markets, it's not just entrepreneurs, it's not just giant corporations, it's not just financial interdependence and so on. So I picked a handful, but you could make this a more complicated story with more time. It's several things, and they don't precisely co-vary. They are sometimes in tension with each other or in partially different timing. So part of the relation to Schumpeter and his own worries about the future of capitalism in the second part of Capitalism, Socialism, Democracy, is that attempts to solve one set of problems in capitalism may in fact undermine the potential for other parts of the system to work. So that you may, in trying to solve some of the tendency towards crisis and creative destruction, undermine the possibility of entrepreneurial capitalism to do its work, for example. So that there are inherent tensions in this, and there will be compromises and balances. To be ideologically committed all one way is to misunderstand that capitalism is really sort of a family of related processes, I would say, not just one thing.
Thank you very much for your interesting and very refreshing contribution and talk. As an Austrian visitor, I was astonished to see how much you refer to two of my personal favorites. First one was Polanyi, and the first question was already related to the issue if there is a positive or negative interpretation of Polanyi. Let me do the same with Schumpeter. I mean, you had a very positive interpretation, and your four principles were grounded upon Schumpeterian economic dynamics and Schumpeterian thought. I mean, Schumpeter differed. He said, can capitalism survive? And rhetorically, he answered immediately, no. In my opinion, no. I mean, you turn Schumpeter against Schumpeter, and I would say you are right. I would sign it. So far. However, I have one brief question or remark. Your talk was entitled Social and Political Challenges Facing Global Capitalism. I mean, you were talking a lot on economic and political challenges, but in my view were a bit silent concerning social challenges. I mean, you referred, of course, to Daniel Bell, cultural contradiction of capitalism. I mean, you could have, in my view, strengthened a bit more the term of culture, which is one of for me, the fundamental principles of conflict in modern capitalist societies and in the global economy. Just to mention one single author, which is Samuel Huntington, with his idea of the clash of civilizations. If you look at the world map and the political map during the last 10 years, in the course of 9/11, then you see all these struggles related to culture, competing religions, and. Okay? Could you, I mean that you have written, I know that you have written widely on religion, but could you specify your perception of religion in the context of challenges of global capitalism?
Okay. The question, the end is can I say more about religion and specify its place in relation to this, and more generally culture, especially in the model of civilizations, clash of civilizations, with a preface that I want to acknowledge of my indebtedness to two Austrians. I could say that a lot of thinking on these issues has been indebted to different Austrians for several generations, and that that much of thinking about the relations between markets and politics has been, if you will, an attempt to solve the problems of Austria in the 1930s. And that specter of that crisis has loomed very, very large for a number of people thinking about these issues, influenced by Hayek and von Mises and Popper and so forth. My attempt was indeed to, in a sense, turn Schumpeter against Schumpeter, that is to back one line of Schumpeterian reasoning and saying that you don't have to see in this what he saw, which was a sad end to capitalism. Schumpeter wasn't anti-capitalist, he just thought it wasn't going to work much longer for various reasons, and I've suggested that these are not all fatal problems. On culture, I have one disagreement with the Huntington line in a big one. It's a big one, but otherwise I'm very sympathetic to the line of argument that you suggest. The Huntington position to me is flawed by assuming that culture refers to the already existing cultural differences that we find among civilizations, among religions, among people. So it's what Catholics or Orthodox or Protestants or Muslims or Buddhists are already. It's what nations are already. It's that, and I want to suggest culture is also creativity. It's just as much culture when people are designing new products and designing new ways to work and creating the culture of Silicon Valley, and that culture is creativity just as much as inheritance. So to me, Huntington leaves the creativity side somewhat out of the picture. And therefore, in a nation, in Russia, in England, in the United States, there is an opportunity to make the future in somewhat different ways. And this is part of why I say, I take the other side of Schumpeter, that we have the opportunity to reshape some of the conditions of our lives. We have the opportunity to make the world in important senses, including culturally. And I would add, as I suggested, the business corporation was a cultural phenomenon, that other institutional creations are cultural phenomena. And that means that we have collectively some capacity to choose. Right? And not just simplistically, oh, do you want democracy or not democracy, but what kind of institutions? How egalitarian or inegalitarian? Just the simple matter. How much inequality do we tolerate? How much do we think is the necessary condition of competition and entrepreneurial opportunity, so that in order to have that freedom and that drive, we have to accept inequality? Well, how much? A ratio of 3-to-1 between the wealthiest and the poorest? 10-to-1? 865-to-1, which is an estimate of the current U.S. number? Right? What is it that you have to take? And I think these are cultural questions too. Norwegian capitalism is quite prosperous with a dramatically lesser level of inequality. So my suggestion is, yes, culture matters. Now on religion, I would say religion is part of this, but religions don't come fixed with no choices. People who are engaged in religion also determine how they're going to be engaged in religion, whether they're going to turn it to violence, whether they are going to believe that there is no room for anyone else to hold a contrary opinion, or whether they're going to be more open-minded. So religion is extremely important. It moves lots of people, but it's not absolutely fixed.
Dear colleagues and friends, I'm sorry to say that our time is up, and this is the end of our session. Let me thank Professor Craic Calhoun for this very stimulating lecture. We wish you success at your new job at London School of Economics and Political Science, and we are hoping to see you here again at the High School of Economics in the future.
Thank you.